So, chapter 6, Mishnah 6. And as we've been doing it, we've been splitting the 48 different things that we're supposed to focus on in order to acquire Torah. We've split them into little clusters. And today we're going to do something very different to everything that we've learned until now. Because up until this point, the focus has been very much on what a person has to do in their own personal development so that they are in a position that they can acquire the Torah. But the four things that we're going to learn about today are directly related, not so much to personal development, as much as the development of others. So that's a very important shift, because that tells us that in order for a person to acquire Torah, they can't just focus on themselves. You know, any other endeavor that a person is involved in, obviously it makes sense that you work on yourself. For example, let's say that a person decided they wanted to run a marathon. Then obviously what they have to do is, on a regular basis, they have to train, they have to run distances. Sure, they might run with other people as well, but the objective is to get their time to be a good time. And the objective is to be able to run without getting tired. So the interest is personal interest. Let's say that a person is qualifying in a particular area and they want to get a degree. So clearly the objective is, I want to qualify so that I could get this degree, so I could then get that opportunity. And so it is pretty much with any area of personal development. It only makes sense that personal development is personal. It's about me. And I focus on myself and what I have to achieve. Here, where we're talking about the path to acquire Torah, which sounds like a personal program of growth and development, now we're going to discover it cannot happen not just without other people. We've already seen that there have to be other people. We've spoken about the fact that you have to be ohuv, you have to be beloved, you have to be oivas abrios, you have to be somebody who loves other people. We've touched on that. But today we're going to learn that a person cannot develop themselves unless they are invested in helping to develop others as well. It's a fascinating perspective. You might remember from last time that the Abarbanel is of the view that at this point, the Mishnah is talking specifically to people who are leaders. Remember, because we said there are 30-odd different characteristics that a person could master, and then when a person has mastered all of those characteristics, then we speak to them from the perspective of their responsibility as a leader. And so he keeps coming back to the theme that here we're talking either to the Rosh Hashiva, or we're talking to the leader of the entire community, what was called the Nasi. But the truth of the matter is that, true as that is, it equally has a lesson for us. Because every single one of us, in order to be able to proceed, in order to be able to progress, in order to be able to grow, we cannot only be focused inward. And you remember also last week that we learned from the Maharal that Torah is something that belongs to the klal. Torah is not an individual asset. Torah was presented to the entire nation. And we know this. You know, people even talk about the fact that, where do I know you from? You look so familiar. And then people say, where do you know? We met at Sinai. Because we understand principally that not only were all the Jews who were alive at the time standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, but the neshama of every single Jew that was ever going to exist until the end of time was also there at Mount Sinai. So that means that it was given to the klal in the most broad fashion. The Torah is the inheritance of the entire Jewish community as a whole. Therefore, the Maharal keeps reiterating that in order for us to acquire Torah, we have to identify that we are part of the klal. And we're going to see that again today. That in order for a person to be able to acquire Torah, they have to identify with the rest of the community as part of their own experience, part of their own shared reality. Now here's the thing. This is all nice in theory. It's all nice in theory. But frankly, sometimes the crowd gets in the way. Especially if you're trying to learn. For example, I'll give you a few examples. Example number one. Have you ever had this experience where you're sitting in a group and you're trying to learn something in a group and there's an individual in the group who makes comments that are off topic and maybe they're just trying to be a little bit humorous or they're trying to, and it gets frustrating, right? We're trying to learn. We're not making progress over here because you keep interrupting us with your imagined humor. Ever had that experience? Or what happens when you're sitting in a group and you're trying to learn something in a group, and a person asks a question that is off topic? That can be highly frustrating. We're trying to focus. We're trying to get through the material. We want to achieve an objective, and you keep going off the topic. So that could be frustrating. You know what else could be frustrating? You're learning in a group, or even if you're learning just with one other person, and you reach a point where there's material that you're incredibly interested in, and you find it fascinating, and like this, you're just getting the ideas like this, and there's somebody else who just can't get it. They just don't understand what's going on. And you feel like they're holding the entire process back because the teacher's got to repeat and then repeat again and explain and give a different example, come from a different angle. So it's all very well in theory to say that we have to work collaboratively in order to learn, but in practice, sometimes it is the klal, sometimes it's the group that actually becomes the obstacle to learning, or so it feels to us. Here's another question. If you had an hour to spare in your day, think about this for a moment. If you had an hour to spare in your day, and you know that Rosh Hashanah is coming up, I don't know, let's say next week, and you want to develop, you want to work on yourself spiritually. So you've got a particular thing that you've chosen to learn because you know that it's going to get you into the right frame of mind for Rosh Hashanah, and it's going to inspire you. So now you've got an hour in your day, and here are the two choices. Find a quiet spot with a nice cup of coffee, turn off your phone, and immerse yourself in the material that you've been so enthusiastic to learn in preparation for Rosh Hashanah. Or take that hour and dedicate it to learn, it may even be the same material, with somebody else who is possibly going to chat in the middle, who is possibly going to not understand as quickly as you, who's possibly going to have a different perspective that may not suit the way that you wanted to learn. Which do you choose? Do you choose to spend the time alone, or do you choose to spend the time with somebody else? Now, the truth of the matter is, I'm not going to ask you to answer that question publicly because it may be uncomfortable. So for many people, the answer is going to be, I'd rather have that time to myself, quite honestly, because I know that I'm going to be focused, and I know that I won't allow disturbance, and I know the pace at which I want to learn, and I know the way that I process, so this is going to work better for me. The question is that the correct approach? And we're going to discover something fascinating in the course of what we're learning over here today about exactly this topic. In order for a person to acquire Torah, there has to be a movement outward. We cannot acquire Torah with only self-interest. And so that's where we are today. The four things that we're going to focus on that have to do with other people. The first is noisei be'oil im chaveroi. There are at least three core interpretations of what this means. So let's look at all of them. First translation. Noisei be'oil im chaveroi means that you carry the load together with your friend. The direct translation of oil is a yoke. So if you can imagine literally carrying a yoke, something that maybe we don't really relate to so much today, right? Where does a person really have anything to do with a yoke? And, but think about the plow, and you've got the animals pulling the plow, and you have more than one animal with a yoke on its shoulders, and then they can pull the plow together, and obviously it'll be much more productive. So over here we say, noisei be'oil im chaveroi, that one of the keys to be able to acquire Torah is that we share the load with our companions, with our compatriots, with our colleagues. Now the question is, what load? What load are we sharing? And we're going to see that there are three views as to what this load is. Bearing in mind, let's go back to what the Abarbanel told us, that at this point we are talking primarily to people who are very spiritually advanced, because our assumption is if you're reading this part, it means you've already mastered all the steps before this. Why else would you be reading this part if you haven't already mastered what came before? This is not just entertainment. We're supposed to read, apply, work on ourselves, and then move to the next level. So the assumption is here we're talking about people who have really mastered all of these incredible steps to acquiring Torah. And now we say the next thing you have to do is you have to share the load with other people. So let's think about it. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the expression, share the load? What's the first thing that comes to mind? Is what? The chev. Exactly. That's exactly what I was hoping you were going to say, right? Because why do they use that line as their marketing line, to share the load? Because that's exactly what they're referring to. They're referring to the financial load. That's exactly what they're referring to. There is, unfortunately, in every community, there's a degree of financial load. There are people who need welfare. There are people who need support. And so we say, share the load. Now, I don't know if the inspiration for the Chev was necessarily this Mishnah, but the principle is a good principle because the person who is so invested in Torah learning, and if we go with our Barbanel's view, not only in learning, but in teaching and leading others, may well say, I don't have to share the financial load, I'm contributing in a different way. I'm contributing through leadership, through inspiration. I don't necessarily have to carry the can of the financial load of the community. In fact, halachically, the Gemara speaks about this and is quite critical of individuals who did not honor this principle. But halachically, those who are involved in the service and leadership of the community, the spiritual leadership, are exempt from local taxes. Go tell SARS. But they are, because in those days, the community used to impose tax on the community, and those taxes went to various things, to security, to the maintenance of the city, the upkeep of various communal spaces. And the people who are the Talmidei Chachamim, the Torah scholars, were exempt from those requirements, from those taxes. Now, this is Pirkei Avos. Remember, Pirkei Avos is Lifnim Mishuras Adin. It's telling us to behave in a way that is beyond the requirement of the law. And that is this message, Noisei Ba'ol Im Chavero. Even though, as far as the law is concerned, you're exempt because you're a Torah scholar, and because you're a teacher, and because you're the Rosh Yeshiva, and because you're the Nasi of the community, or whatever the case is, and therefore you're exempt from participating in the contributions to the community, still, you should step up to the plate, and you should actually make a contribution in spite of the fact that you're actually exempt from doing so. You know, it's very, very interesting. It's a slight sidebar, but just to give the attitude and perspective of how Judaism looks at this, the question is, we all know that we are obligated to give tzedakah, correct? Right? We all know that. We all know that we're obligated to give tzedakah. What we don't necessarily have clarity on is, at which financial level do you become obligated to give tzedakah? In other words, if God forbid a person is in a position that they are reliant on the community for welfare, are they required to give tzedakah? Interesting question, right? So now you've got to ask yourself this. Just step out of that for 1 second. Why do we call charity tzedakah? Tzedakah doesn't mean fairness, it means justice, righteousness, right? But from the word tzedek, which is just. We don't call charity chesed. Chesed is a different concept. And in fact, there's a whole question whether tzedakah and gemilas chasadim are in fact the same mitzvah. Because chesed is a state of emotion, of benevolence, of giving, of generosity, and that really has to do either with your character or your mood. A person could be a chesed person, or a person could be in a chesed state of mind at a particular point in time. Tzedakah comes from the word tzedek, which means it is the just and correct thing to do, which implies that it's regardless of how you feel and regardless of what your personality is. Because it's the right thing to do. So if it's the right thing to do, then by right, tzedakah applies to everybody, even the person who is on welfare. Because it's not about being generous, it's not about being kind, it's about a system that Hashem created in the world, which is that everybody should, in some degree, be a giver as well as a receiver. So even if a person is on the receiving end, they should never not be a giver. So here, noise ba'ol im chavero. Yes, of course, you're contributing to society. You're doing so in a tremendous way. You're a leader. You're a spiritual inspiration to so many people. Still, noise ba'ol im chavero. You should carry the weight of the requirements of the community as well. Very interesting lesson. That's only one of the opinions. There's another opinion which is perhaps even more fascinating. Listen to this. You're going to love this. What other load might the community carry? Let's try to think as laterally as possible. What other load, what other stress might there be on the community besides actual financial stress? And just think about this for a second. And you don't have to think that far, because you could actually think about what we're going through as a Jewish world currently. So what other stress might the community face? Emotional stress. What would be a possible cause of emotional stress? Security, right? So can we not just use one big catch-all word that applies to all of the things that might cause emotional stress to the community? It's a very popular word. We use it a lot. Maybe not as popular as I thought. Okay. Tzoros. Tzoros. The community faces tzoros. So it could be the threat of, God forbid, war. It could be, God forbid, disease. It could be, God forbid, that there is a breakdown in the communal structures in some way. Shared tzoros. Now, let's say for argument's sake that there was, and I'm going to use specific examples because these are examples that are brought in the Gemara. So let's say that there was, God forbid, a drought in Israel. What's the correct way that we're supposed to respond, halachically, if there's a drought in Israel? To daven, yes, and fast. Right? The whole Gemara Tainis, which is about fasting, starts off by telling us about the cycles of drought and how you fast if, God forbid, there's a drought in Israel. Likewise, if there's a war, you're supposed to fast. Right? And we know, for example, a great example would be the story of Purim, where they fasted. Not only did they fast before Esther went to the king, but they also fasted on the day that they went to war to protect themselves. And that's actually where the fast of Esther originates. It's the fast that they had when they were going to war, not the fast that they had 11 months earlier before Esther went to see the king. So now here's the thing. Are you ready for this? Here's the thing. Why do droughts happen? We've learned this already. We had this in the Mishnah quite a while back in, what was it, chapter 4. Why do droughts happen? Why do wars happen? We said, cherev ba la'olam, but tzoros ba. Why do these things happen? We learned it. It's because people do not observe the mitzvahs that they're supposed to observe. That's the only reason bad things happen on the grand scale like that. And if you want the catch-all phrase for this, we say it in our davening, mipnei chato'enu golinu me'artzenu. The whole principle of golus is a result of chato'enu. It's because we didn't behave the way that we should. So therefore, if we have to declare a public fast, let's say, because God forbid there's a drought or the threat of war or some kind of a pandemic, or whatever the case is, if we have to call a communal fast, what's the intention of that fast? Is it just to get people not to eat? Is that the intention? It's to share the load. It's basically to say, the Rambam writes very clearly when it comes to the laws of fasting, or it actually speaks about it in the laws of Teshuvah. So the Rambam says very clearly that the fast in and of itself has no value. The point of the fast is to remind us that we have to do Teshuvah. So therefore, a fast without Teshuvah is a meaningless exercise. The idea of the fast is to awaken us to do Teshuvah. Therefore, who should have to fast in a time of crisis? People who need to do Teshuvah. Okay, you would think people who need to do Teshuvah, in other words, the people who are responsible for the chait, again, going back to the Mishnah that we learned about what causes war and what causes famine, etc. It was very specific kinds of behavior where people don't keep the Shemitah or they don't give the gifts to the poor, etc. So this person who is now the Nasi, who is the spiritual leader of the community, could easily say, look, my job is to get everybody else to do Teshuvah. I am not the cause of this problem. I'm not the reason that we're facing this crisis. It's the rest of the community. So let me get them to fast, and that way we'll avert the disaster. Says the Mishnah, noisei ba'oil im chaveroi. What it means is that actually you have to carry the load together with everybody else, even if you are personally immune from the problem that the rest of the community is dealing with. You know, they say that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who of course we know was an incredibly great person, he made one of the greatest contributions to halacha in history. He's also most well known probably for composing the Zohar, which is the basis of all Jewish mysticism. So I think you'd agree he was a great man. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, they say, never experienced the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. In other words, even though he lived in the period of the destruction, he never experienced the destruction. Because for us, the destruction is marked by the fact that there used to be a building called the Beis Hamikdash, which was very important to us, and that building was destroyed. And then as a result, Jews were scattered all over the world. That's how we interpret what happened. But the reality is what actually happened is that there was divine revelation that was accessible to every single human being, not only Jewish people. Non-Jewish people were allowed to come and experience and participate as well. So there was divine revelation that was wholesale available, and that was taken away from us. That is the definition of Golus. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, despite having lived through that period, never lost that divine revelation. So that's why the expression is that for him, the Churban never happened. The whole impact Never happened. And yet, if you know a little bit of the biography of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, despite the fact that he was flying at such a spiritual altitude that we can't even begin to imagine, he made a point of getting very involved in the realities of what everybody else was dealing with and helping and coaching them to get the spiritual value that they needed to get. Noisei ba'oil im chaveroi. He went to carry the load that wasn't really his load. He was kind of immune to these problems, and yet he put his shoulder to the wheel to assist the community to be able to achieve spiritually what they had to achieve. That's the message over here. There's nobody in the community can step back and say, it's not my issue. I don't do those things. I'm very focused. I'm very religious. I'm very spiritual. I don't have these problems. It's their problems. You know the expression we use in Yiddish, yenem. You know, it's somebody else's issues. Well, that's what it's telling us over here. Noise ba'olim chaveiro means that every single person has to recognize that if it's an issue, it's my issue. Can anybody identify the very, I don't know if it's the very first, I think it's fair to say probably it's the first, but certainly the most stark example of exactly this. Somebody who in and of themselves spiritually was way beyond the mess that the people had performed, and yet was directly, number one, impacted, and number two, took responsibility for it. Moshe, right? Moshe is on Mount Sinai. Now, quite honestly, I don't know if Mount Sinai today is such a big chap like it used to be, but there was a time that Har Sinai was like a really big deal for about a few hours. And at that time, Moshe is on Mount Sinai, which really means he crossed some kind of a portal into heaven. Like he climbed a mountain and he disappeared into another reality. And the Gemara tells us a story about his interactions over there and the angels and how he holds onto the divine throne, etc., etc. It's a very advanced experience. And while he is there, the Jews get a little bit impatient. By the way, this whole thing could have been avoided. I mean, it's a side point, but the whole golden calf could have been avoided. You know how? They should have just brought out more food. If the Jews were eating, they wouldn't have been so upset. Everything would have been fine. So they're making a golden calf. That's the one lower end or lowest end of the spiritual spectrum, while Moshe is basking in the divine glory, speaking face to face with Hashem, the highest end of the spiritual spectrum. What does Hashem tell Moshe as soon as they make the golden calf? Anybody remember the pasuk? Lech raid. Lech raid. Go down to the Jews because they've made a golden calf. So Rashi immediately points out, based on Chazal, why does it say Lech raid? Go down. It could have just said Lech, go to the people. Why the emphasis on the word raid? And he answers that raid migdulascha, because of the fact that the Jews have done something which was so severe and they've made a golden calf, therefore Moshe is demoted from his own spiritual state because of the people. Noise ba'oil im chaveroi. We carry a shared load. That's how it works. If the lowest Jew is elevated, we're all elevated. If the lowest Jew is demoted or spiritually off the rails, we're all demoted. That's the message over here. Noise ba'oil im chaveroi, that we all share a load. It doesn't matter how advanced we are, doesn't matter how learned we are, doesn't matter how spiritual we are. At the end of the day, we have to consider the reality that we all carry the load together. That goes back to what the Maharal said. Torah is given to the klal. Torah is the inheritance, the property of the community. If a person does not recognize that we're all part of a community and therefore we all have a shared experience and therefore we all have to carry the load together, then the person precludes themselves from access to Torah. And that translates into the third explanation, which is really, really practical. Really practical. When we're in the context of people learning, what would you use the metaphor of carrying the load in the specific context of learning? Let's think about that for a second. Okay, let's take this from a different angle. I don't know how many shiurim everybody attends. I don't know how many podcasts you listen to. I don't know how many droshas you go and listen to in shul. I was actually thinking about it, dafka, this morning, about how important it is that the seats in shul should not be too comfortable. I was thinking about it this morning. Thank God they don't have to be the most uncomfortable seats. Some people might have grown up in the shuls with those pews, where you can barely move. But what's the value? It's much more difficult to fall asleep in the drosha. If you're not comfortable, if you have this big comfortable chair with arms and padding and this and whatever, you can settle in for a good drosha. I had somebody once complain to me and said, your droshas are too short. They can't even get to fall asleep. They don't speak long enough. So I don't know how many shiurim you go to or what you listen to, etc. But let's be honest, not every shiur, not every time the same shiur is the same. Sometimes you cannot believe that it just flew by. That was amazing. It was just this incredible experience, and it was so engaging, and I was blown away by the content, and before I blinked, it was over. Other times, you sit there thinking, oh my word, when is this thing going to end? It's just going on, and it feels like we're rehashing the same concept again and again. And by the way, that's I'm just saying from the perspective of the teacher. I don't know about the student. I always say the worst thing that could ever happen is to fall asleep in a shiur if you're giving it. So, yes, exactly. So the thing is this. So the thing is, we all know that different learnings have different experiences attached to them. And when you have different people together learning, that changes the dynamic and complicates the dynamic. So the classic way that we're supposed to learn is we're always supposed to learn in a group, ideally. That's the way we're supposed to learn. At the very least, we have what we call a chavrusa, where you sit with two people learning together. And even better than that is to learn in a group. And if you have more than 10 people learning together, it's a very big deal. We learned about that also in a previous Mishnah. The downside is the person who is slower than us. And it can be very frustrating when we're trying to learn and the other person is slower than us. And they're not slower than us because they're lazy. They're just, it is, we're all wired differently. Some topics we get quicker and some topics they get quicker. So when it's that scenario that we're understanding and the next person is not understanding, or when we're the teacher and the other person, the student, is slow to understand, we could get frustrated. And therefore, he tells us, noisei ba'oil im chavero. The word over here is chavero, is specifically your study partner. And when you're sitting with another person or a group of people and you're studying together with them, and they are taking longer and they're not understanding so easily, and you're getting frustrated, and you could feel to yourself, you know what? This wasn't a good idea. I could have learned on my own, and I would have moved at a pace that was much more in my interest, much more comfortable for me. And here I am, stuck with this passenger. It's I don't know if you ever saw that meme of the man standing outside his car in what's clearly a petrol station, and it says, every father on a long road trip, when his kids have to go to the bathroom, and he's watching all the trucks that he already overtook driving past. So that's kind of what it is, right? Here we are. I thought I was going to make so much progress, and now we're falling behind. I set a target for myself, and I'm falling behind. Or I wanted to really learn a particular thing, and now I can't because this person is still holding me back on some level. So noise ba'ol im chaveroi tells us that the responsibility that we have to learn, and in order for us to actually acquire Torah, is to be able to help the person who is carrying the learning as a load. We may not feel it as a load. We may not feel it as a burden. We may feel Torah as a joy. And we love it and we embrace it and we get excited when we have the opportunity to learn. And we actually want to just fob off the person who's finding it more tedious. So noise ba'olim chavero is a very profound lesson that if a person wants to acquire Torah, it's not a race. It's not about how far I get. It's about how much we learn. And so I have a responsibility actually to lean back to help the person who's not able to progress at the same pace that I am. Now comes a fascinating point. Fascinating. The first Rebbe of Chabad, the Alter Rebbe, writes as follows. When a person learns with somebody else or teaches somebody else Torah, the bracha that they get is that their own mind becomes 1,000 times clearer. In other words, we all believe that if we're engaged in teaching somebody else, it's going to come at some level of sacrifice, because I could have moved at a particular pace and I could have learned so much, but unfortunately for me, I've taken responsibility of somebody who's weaker, and therefore that slowed the process. That may be true time-wise, but the gift that Hashem gives us is that the quality of our own learning afterwards is so vastly increased that it more than compensates for the quantity of time that we feel that we lost. So that's why noisa ba'oil im chaveroi, if we're willing to help other people in their learning and their development, that actually helps us to acquire the Torah, even though it's counterintuitive, because in our minds we think, if I want to acquire the Torah, I need to work on acquiring the Torah, and I shouldn't be wasting my time, so to speak, teaching other people. And yet, it's dafka through that teaching of other people that we actually open our minds and are able to learn in a completely different way. And if you look, Moshe would be, again, a great example of this, because somebody of the caliber of Moshe, with his level of understanding and his incredible developed spirituality, you would think that if a person like that could sit for 40 years learning Torah on his own, who would he have become? And yet he spent 40 years teaching everybody else, and look who he became. So it's a great model for us, to focus on.
One teaches to learn.
No, one teaches. I'm saying one teaches, one learns, and one is completely revolutionized. Right? The teacher doesn't just simply learn. And the Gemara says this, that the most learning that I ever achieve is from teaching. So it's a revolution in terms of the understanding that the person has. And by the way, this is not pie in the sky. We all know this from our own experience. When you are forced to explain something to another person who doesn't necessarily know things as well as you do, you land up with far, far better insight into the information yourself. So this is real, it's practical, it's not pie in the sky. The next thing he says, again, the responsibility that we have to the next person is, O machrioi lekaf zechus. Such an interesting expression. So we all know what kaf zechus is, right? What's kaf zechus? How would you translate kaf zechus? The what? Good. So hold that thought. I'm going to come back to that in a second. So just the words kaf zechus. How do you translate it? See, this is what happens. We become so familiar with these terms that we know what the term means without necessarily knowing the translation. So let's just focus on the translation for a second. We'll come back to what it means. What's kaf zechus?
Spoon of merit.
That is the spoon of merit. There you go. The kaf. What is a kaf? Why is a spoon called a kaf? A kaf, right, the kaf of your hand is the palm of your hand. A spoon, the concave part of the spoon is called the kaf. So where else, it's Rosh Hashanah time, we should know this, where else do we have a kaf at this time of the year? Kaf moiznayim. We have the two placeholders of a scale. So if you think of the classic scale, it's got these two placeholders. So one is called kaf zechus, one is the meritorious side of the scale, and one is called kaf choiva, which is the, so to speak, condemned part of the scale. That's what kaf zechus means. To put somebody in their scale, which means how we measure them, lekaf zechus, in the positive. Now we can go back to the expression. Don lekaf zechus means to give somebody the benefit of the doubt. That's what it means, right? When we encounter somebody behaving in a particular way, so it's quite natural for us often just to assign a judgment to how they're behaving. And based on our assessment, we believe, obviously, that we must be right. So therefore, we are justified in accusing them or judging or criticizing them for a particular behavior. So the halacha is, have done es kol adam lekaf zechus. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to judge a person. Hear the words. Done. We're supposed to judge a person. How do you judge a person? You weigh up the positive, you weigh up the negative, and if you're done lekaf zechus, that means you let the positive outweigh the negative. That's literally what it means. Done, judge a person lekaf zechus, with more weight on the side of the scale that is the side of merit. Now we already know this principle, we've already learned it before. Why would the Mishnah here repeat it when it's telling us how to get to acquire Torah? We already know that we're supposed to have a donas kol ha'adam lekaf zechus. This is not news to us. We've learned it already previously, that you're supposed to judge people favorably. What's the message over here? Bearing in mind that if you go with the opinion of the Abarbanel, we're talking here to the leadership. We're not just talking about to anybody, or at least according to many of the commentaries, we're talking about people who have mastered many of the steps to be able to acquire Torah. So what does it mean, machri'oi? Let's understand that word. What does the word machri'oi mean, or machri'ah? To?
Force.
That's machriach, is to force. What's machri'ah?
Bound down.
No, that's korea. What's machri'ah? Where do we have this line, this word? Are you familiar with this word? It comes up in something that we say fairly regularly. What do we say? You know the Brisa Rabbi Yishmael with the 13 different ways that we're supposed to interpret the Torah? So at the end of that it says as follows, V'chein shenei chsuvim amachachishim zeh zeh. Likewise, if you have two psukim, two verses in the Torah that appear to be contradictory, you don't know how to resolve them, ad sheyavo yakosev ashlishi, until the third, what appears to be possibly unrelated pasuk, weighs in on the story, u'machriya beinehem. What does machriya mean? Decides. Machriya means to decide, which means if you have something which is unclear, or to use our metaphor, hanging in the balance, then machriya means you clarify, you decide which way it's going to go. So if we're talking about the scale of judgment, don eskol adam lekaf schus, that we're supposed to judge a person favorably, let's just talk about that for a second. What does it look like to judge a person favorably? Anybody got a nice example of judging somebody favorably? Leave the names out of it, but that's just a good example of judging somebody favorably.
Show the decision to imagine what would happen, as opposed to what to know what actually happened.
Exactly.
So it's correct.
Exactly. So something happens and a person behaves in a particular way that we are either upset by or disappointed in, and instead of coming to the conclusion of what we believe happened, we allow ourselves to imagine other possibilities of what might have happened. So for example, I'll give you an example. Last week we had this event to celebrate our community's 25th anniversary. So somebody didn't arrive at the event, and the next morning they phoned me and they said that they just wanted to clarify the reason they didn't come to the event was because they weren't invited. and they said, we hope that you don't judge us that we were boycotting the event. So I said, listen, I sent out many invitations. You were definitely on the list. I don't know what happened, why you didn't get it. On the back end of the system, it actually reflects that you opened the invitation, but we won't go there. But I never for a moment thought you boycotted the event. I actually thought the reason you didn't come was, and there was a specific reason that I thought that they actually couldn't come. So that's what you want to try and do, right? Don lekaf schus. You don't turn around and say, well, chutzpah, we're having an event and you didn't come, you didn't even send a mazel tov. Nothing, what's with you people? What happened was there was some kind of a clear glitch in the system. They didn't get the invitation. They were feeling uncomfortable. They didn't want to make us, it was one of those things. So that's what it means, don lekaf schus, right? That's what it means. So in other words, if I'm don lekaf schus, let's think about this for a second. Meaning to say, if I choose to judge somebody favorably, will I be right? No guarantees. In fact, there's about as much guarantee that if I decide that they did something wrong or malicious, there's about as much chance I'll be wrong about that as I'll be wrong about the way that I'm choosing to be don lekaf schus. In other words, yes, it's correct that we're supposed to judge people favorably and not write them off and not get upset at people for no good reason. That's all true. It does not mean that it will be accurate what our assumption is, even though we're trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. Machriya lekaf schus is something way beyond that. Machriya lekaf schus does not mean that I'm a nice person who is trying to defend somebody when they behaved in a way that doesn't seem nice. That's don lekaf schus. Machriya lekaf schus means I am honest and bold enough to recognize that they are not behaving the way that they should. And I'm going to help them to learn how to do better. Machriyoi lekaf schus. I'm going to actually move them across into the realm of schus, into the realm of merit. Not just in my mind pretend that they are behaving well. This is fascinating because we do know that one of the principles in Judaism is that we're not supposed to stand by idly when we see a person behaving in a poor way. We're actually supposed to get involved. We're supposed to direct people. We're supposed to encourage people to behave better. Earlier in this Mishnah, we said that one of the ways that a person acquires Torah is that they appreciate being rebuked. Here we're saying, okay, we don't use the word rebuke over here. We don't say that. But there is a responsibility, lehachriya, to help confirm that the person belongs in the world of schus. That's part of our responsibility to each other. To put it a little differently, they tell the story. Everybody is familiar with, I'm sure, you've heard stories of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev had this uncanny way of excusing the behavior of people that appeared to be inexcusable. So, for example, on one occasion, a person burst into shul and he was really angry because outside there was a guy, they were very simple Jews who really didn't know halacha, and there was a guy outside fixing the wheel of his wagon while he was wearing his talis and tefillin. And this person burst into shul all angry, and he said, the chutzpah, he has no respect for his talis and tefillin, he's doing such a menial job. Imagine somebody doing an oil change on their car while wearing their talis and tefillin. I mean, it's kind of the equivalent. He was so upset about it. And Rabbi Yitzchak heard this and he said, wow, Hashem, look how amazing your people are. Even when they have to fix their wagon wheels, they still want to keep your mitzvahs of the talis and tefillin. Right? That's don lekaf schus. That's moving somebody over into the side of merit. But the truth is, there's something even more profound than that. And that is where you recognize that the person is not where they should be, and you assist them to get to the kaf schus. So they actually are meritorious, not only being covered by some benevolent individual. Now that comes straight back to what we've just spoken about, because noisa ba'ol im chaveiro, when you're carrying the burden together with somebody else, we said the third explanation was that if somebody's battling in their learning, we're supposed to be there with them, helping them along, and not just saying, no, I'll be done lekaf schus. They tried their best. They tried. And unfortunately, they have limited capacity, so they were not necessarily able to learn. Now, there's a problem with that, because if we don't learn things properly, then we don't actually know how we're supposed to behave. If we don't know how we're supposed to behave, we can't really be in the kaf schus. We can't really be in the place of merit. And so the two of these lessons go hand in hand. Noisa ba'ol im chaveiro, to be able to invest the time and the energy and the patience to actually learn together with the person who is not necessarily learning at a pace on their own accord, is not necessarily able to grasp things on their own accord. That's going to be machri oy lekaf schus. That's going to get a person into the realm of merit. One more piece, just on this. You know those cartoons with the little angel on the one shoulder and the little devil on the other shoulder? Does life ever feel that way? We've got like two voices in our heads. The one voice is saying, do X, another one saying, nah, it's not necessary. Or the one that's saying, go ahead, do a mitzvah, ask a question about the shir, and the other voice is saying, don't make a fool of yourself. That's how we are. We always have these tensions inside of ourselves, which is basically like a scale, if you think about it. It's an internal scale. Besides the scale that we always talk about in terms of Hashem judging us and mitzvahs on the one side and whatever, there's an internal scale that's always being balanced at any given time. The Rambam talks about the fact that at any moment in our lives, he says in Hilchas Tshuva, we're supposed to view ourselves as if we are in a perfect balance between the positive and the negative, and our next decision is going to make all of the difference to us and potentially to the whole world. Sometimes people need a little bit of assistance. They need a little bit of a push. They need somebody to step into their world to help them to tip that scale. Just a little bit of encouragement. It's incredible how often a person, when they hear a little bit of positivity about their own spirituality, about their own Yiddishkeit, that could be the catalyst for them moving in a particular direction. And so, machriya lekaf schus, when we get a person to, so to speak, weigh in on the side of schus, on the side of merit, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to do something earth-shattering, that we necessarily have to teach them a whole principle. Sometimes it's just giving a person a bit of encouragement and a little bit of a compliment for the Yiddishkeit. And sometimes that really makes all the difference. And that's a take-home. That's something that every single one of us can do. When we see a person who's invested in the Yiddishkeit, doing a little bit, and maybe they're self-conscious, and we come over to them and say, you're doing great, that could really make a big difference to them.